Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our virtual panel on the ongoing Hamas-Israel war in Gaza. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. Today is day 12 since the unprecedented and shocking Hamas attacks on Israel and the war on Hamas in Gaza. As of today, more than 1,400 Israelis have been killed and more than 4,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. Hamas confirmed it has more than 200 hostages yesterday and said it will be willing to immediately release the hostages, foreign and Israeli, if Israel stops its airstrikes on Gaza. Yesterday's tragic airstrike on the Ma'madani hospital killed hundreds of Palestinians, triggering outrage and protests across the Arab world, from Ramallah to Amman to Beirut to Tunis and elsewhere. Another inflection point in this conflict that prompted the postponement of the Arab Summit in Jordan by its host, King Abdullah. President Biden is in Israel today, has met with Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and reiterated his support for the people of Israel and for Israel. Fears of escalation rise further as this conflict intensifies and expands beyond Gaza, particularly as the northern front on the border with Lebanon remains tense. There is a lot to discuss today with an expert panel of Wilson Fellows and alums. Ambassador David Hale is a global fellow at the Wilson Center and former ambassador to Lebanon, Jordan, and Pakistan. Guy Laron, a Wilson alum and senior lecturer at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And last but not least, Dalia Daseke, another Wilson alum and senior fellow at UCLA's Berkeley Center for International Relations. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Guy, I will start with you since President Biden is in Israel today, shoring up United States support for Israel and particularly the Israeli people, those who have lost loved ones, family and friends in the Hamas attacks, and the families of the hostages whose future is uncertain. What is the current mood in Israel today, and what is your assessment of what is happening?
Well, just to give you the feel of what's it like to be in Tel Aviv right now, I'm hoping that sirens calling on us to go to shelter won't cut short my presentation. At the same time, I'm kind of certain that they won't, because Hamas has been very punctual in the last few days, lobbing missiles exactly at 8 p.m., which is, a few hours from now. So maybe we'll be good on that. So Israel has been on the news until the events of 7th October because of the judicial coup. And that gave that sense of a country that experienced a kind of a cold civil war, an intense political strife. And the events of 7th October didn't lessen that domestic tension. In fact, they intensified it. Okay, so that casts a huge shadow over the response of the Israeli government to what has happened. So maybe the main thing to start with, that on the 7th of October, and the Israeli public and the Israeli elite are in the process of digesting it. What happened on the morning of the 7th of October is the Bibi doctrine that was the leading star of Israeli foreign policy towards the conflict with the Palestinians and toward the Arab world. It collapsed. Okay, what was the Bibi doctrine? It says it's a good thing to weaken the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank. It's a good thing to have Hamas in power on the Gaza Strip. That ensures the division between the two parts of the Palestinian population. It is all funded by Qatar, so it comes cheap. And you can leapfrog above the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and make peace with countries in the Persian Gulf, as we've seen in the Abrams Accords. And as was discussed in the last few weeks about this normalization process with Saudi Arabia. So what the events on 7 October show that it doesn't work. In fact, trying to create some kind of a modus vivendi with Hamas doesn't work at all. So right now, Netanyahu is laser focused on his political survivor, and that colors everything else. So let's start with the hostages. So it's clear that he doesn't want to deal with that. He's been very slow to meet with the relatives of the hostages. There were several violent attacks on the relatives that are currently demonstrating at the center of Tel Aviv every day in demand for the immediate release of the hostages. And as you mentioned, that Hamas is willing to trade the hostages. So the Israeli government isn't willing to talk about that. Several thugs attacked those relatives while demonstrating. Netanyahu has not condemned it. He took his own sweet time to meet with the relatives of the hostages. And when he did, he made sure that someone entered the meeting who doesn't have anyone, any relative in Gaza right now, and said something along the lines that I'm willing to sacrifice my daughter's life in order that the Israeli government would be able to vanquish against Hamas. So that the reports that would come out of the meeting would say that the families are divided about what to do, which isn't the case. Why he doesn't deal with the issue of the hostages? I think Netanyahu knows that in order that there would be a prisoners of war swap between Israel and Hamas, there has to be a ceasefire, and haggling over the exchange of POWs would take a few weeks, and then the whole momentum for a ground operation in Gaza would be lost. And there would be space to ask who's to blame for what happened. And people would obviously demand him to resign. So that's issue number one. And if you're thinking what the Israeli government is willing to do to release the hostages, so far it seems that it doesn't even want to discuss it. So that's item number one. Another important issue is whether or not Israel would start a ground operation in Gaza. That's something the other speakers would discuss as well, because that has the potential to escalate the whole situation, to drag Hezbollah in, that might respond from Lebanon. So what's going on with that? Why, in fact, it hasn't happened? Because there was overwhelming support in Israel for a ground operation in Gaza. So Netanyahu was always against using infantry on a mass scale in any conflict, also in Lebanon, but in other cases. Right now, I think, again, the issue of his political survival is dependent on that some kind of an operation would take place. Several sources within the government and the military establishment started briefing the media and telling something along the line that once we get into Gaza, we'll have to stay there for several months, even a year. So as long as the war is going on in Gaza, Netanyahu and his government would be able to say, look, there's a war right now. It's not the time to discuss who is to blame, who needs to resign, who needs to bear the consequences of the military debacle that happened on the morning of 7th of October. So that's like the Netanyahu perspective, but he's not alone. He has the Biden administration to deal with, and I think that's one of the reasons that Biden was here. President Biden and Biden people demand from Netanyahu to get a clear timetable for the ground operation. That's one. And also that Netanyahu would spell out exactly what he hopes to achieve by getting ground troops into Gaza. Okay? The same demand is coming from the new ministers to just join this new unity government in Israel, especially Benny Gantz, a former chief of staff, a former minister of defense. He's a strong believer in a robust Israeli-American alliance, and he seems to be very much attuned to what the Americans are demanding to know from Netanyahu. So Gantz is demanding the same thing. Please, Netanyahu, spell out what exactly you want to do in Gaza and how long would it take. And because of that internal strife within the cabinet, and because Netanyahu, I don't think he ever gave clear answers to what he hopes to achieve by getting into Gaza. His answers so far were kind of cloudy and unclear. That is the reason that the ground operation hasn't started up to now. Mm-hmm. So what comes next? The future is wide open. So two possibilities that people are discussing, that maybe that's a chance. I mean, you clutch the victory out of the jaws of defeat, and maybe what just happened would lead to a scenario in which the Palestinian Authority would get into Gaza after an Israeli operation there, after some kind of a operation that would dismantle Hamas's military capabilities, that the PA would enter Gaza with American support, with Saudi funding, with Israeli permission. And in that case, maybe we'll see some kind of a settlement and a peace between Israel and the Palestinians. That's, kind of an optimistic scenario. A pessimistic scenario is what would happen if Israel enters in force. Mm-hmm. The battles inside Gaza would become bloody. Would tensions between Jews and Arabs inside Israel would escalate?
Right.
And yeah. The extreme right is preparing exactly for that scenario. Mm-hmm. The Minister of Police, who is a Jewish supremacist, he's going all over Israel right now, mm-hmm. Advising people to buy guns and lowering the threshold for people to get a weapon license. So, and how it would come about, it's unclear. One of the triggers is always that the extreme right insists on visiting Temple Mount, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that if that would happen, that's really the pessimistic scenario. You could see Israel becoming even more chaotic and unpredictable.
Thank you, Guy. You've gave us a lot to process and very interesting dimensions. And I'm going to pick up on basically what you said on the ground invasion and how this will pull in other non-state actors, primarily Hezbollah. So Ambassador Hale, the State Department last night, Eastern time, issued a level 4 travel warning for Lebanon. There were thousands of protesters outside of the U.S. Embassy following the bombing of the hospital. And Hassan Nasrallah called today a day of rage. We've also been seeing rockets back and forth across the border, killing people. But so far, Hezbollah has shown some restraint. How do you see the situation unfolding? And what is your current assessment?
Well, thank you, Marissa. Before I delve into that, I think I need to emphasize something, and I appreciate your introduction as well, Marissa. But we're all going to sound like dry, unemotional foreign policy analysts if this discussion continues the way it is. And I have to express my profound sympathy for the Israeli people right now. Israel is in great distress. The pictures that we saw on Saturday, October 7th, were shocking beyond belief. The idea that not only would individuals rape and murder women and kill children, but then post their pictures online with pride is something that is going to be an indelible factor in U.S. and Israeli, and I hope Arab foreign policies as we try to prevent this from escalating and becoming worse. And so I really don't want to sound like another foreign policy wonk dealing with a humanitarian situation as it is, aggravated, of course, by the horror of what happened. And President Biden himself said initial indications were that this may have been an Islamic Jihad missile that struck the hospital in Gaza, but this is all too predictable. I'd like to go back to U.S. foreign policy and that, but to answer your question, Hezbollah is, of course, a proxy of Iran, as is Hamas. So they have a lot of latitude in Lebanon because of their successful strategy of domination there. But when it comes to Palestinian issues, they will respond importantly to direction from Tehran. That said, the Iranians, and for that matter, Hezbollah, are happy to see Palestinians die to the last Palestinian in fighting Israel. Hezbollah is motivated by the Palestinian cause, its rank and file, by the situation in Jerusalem, by the so-called occupation of Al-Quds Mosque. But the fact is they've barely ever lifted a finger on behalf of the Palestinian people. And so I think what you're seeing now is beyond the normal, but still within the red lines as previously understood between Israel and Lebanon. I don't think Hezbollah wants to provoke an Israeli second front, nor would Israel in any sense want to have that as well. Their first order of business is restoring deterrence against Hamas, reestablishing their intelligence network, which clearly failed them greatly, and find a new paradigm to deal with Hamas, which clearly had failed. I would also add that Hezbollah is going to try to reap the benefits from this, but they're not going to want to expose themselves to the risks, I think, of greater involvement, unless, of course, the situation, as you've alluded to, Marissa, gets so bloody in a ground offensive in Gaza that there is a sense of public pressure and Iranian desire to add pressure. If there's a sense that Israel is weak, if there's a sense that Israel is unable to cope with the situation in Gaza, then Hezbollah, of course, will exploit that fully. But I want to go back, if I may, have just another minute or two, to policy. I mean, please. Yeah, clearly Netanyahu is a loser in this. His entire profile has been one of strength, and Israel, unfortunately, did not show strength, which led to this probing by Hamas. U.S. policy also may be held accountable for all of our accommodations of the last year and a half toward Iran in terms of the hostage payment scheme, the unannounced but very real lifting of sanctions, and non-enforcement anyway, of oil sanctions, and some kind of unstated agreement about uranium enrichment. All of this, I assume, is interpreted by the Iranians as a sign of weakness on the part of the U.S., the internal division within Israel, IDF striking against its own government and people. All of these things added up to perhaps a sense that there was an opportunity to exploit here. And so it's absolutely essential, if we're going to regain our ability to bring peace and stability to the Middle East, that above all, we have to restore deterrence. We have to restore an image of strength by the United States and its Israeli and Arab allies. Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, David, and thank you for your words of sympathy and empathy, and for this reminder about how important it is to also recognize the horror that we have witnessed, and how this is affecting innocent lives in the region, particularly in Israel and in the Palestinian Territories in Gaza. Dalia, I want to turn to you to zoom into the dire humanitarian conditions in Gaza. So far, more than 4,000 people have been killed, but over 11,000 wounded. And as it stands to be one of the most densely populated areas in the world, there are no places for many Palestinians to find safe haven. And with the bombardments continuing, it becomes more and more difficult for a humanitarian corridor to basically take shape. And so far, there have been intense negotiations. The United States has appointed, or President Biden has appointed Ambassador David Satterfield to focus on that. So do you think that the United States will be successful in its diplomacy, particularly with the focus on this humanitarian situation in Gaza?
Thanks, Marissa. And yeah, I wish I could be optimistic there. I think David is right. Having these dry analytic discussions, seem out of place when you're having such a dire crisis in this region. On the other hand, that's our jobs. And so, because these dire humanitarian conditions and the absolutely horrific attack that Israel faced on October 7th, because it is so unprecedented and so dangerous, and this could easily escalate, we really do need to break this down. What's the trigger? What could prevent things? I differ a little bit from David, and I think yes, we can put all the blame on Iran. Certainly, we know Iran trains and funds and it gives military support actively, not just to Hamas, but the other members of the so-called resistance camp, Hezbollah, Shia proxies and militias in Iraq, which are quite dangerous to U.S. forces. So we know this. But I also think it's important to remember this is a Palestinian story too. And, the idea that just kind of Iran saw our weakness and they capitalized on it's not exactly, I think we all need to have some humility. We don't exactly know what all the actors knew at the time. One thing that is interesting, and we do know, is that the U.S., the Israelis, and the Iranians are all denying that Iran had a direct role in this particular attack. Not, of course, that they support Hamas. We know that. So I think it's important and this gets to your question on humanitarian conditions, there is a context here. This didn't come out of a vacuum. You've had 16 years of blockade of the Gaza Strip. There has been, as Guy outlined, no strategy. It's been this mowing the lawn, kind of just let's keep pushing it off, get Qatari money in there, keep things quiet as long as possible. The people suffer, very limited movement of goods and people, over 80% of the population living in poverty, over 80% of youth unemployed. It's a very tiny area, as you said, Marissa, one of the most densely populated in the world, with a very high youth population. Most of the children are in need of mental health support. This is before the war, by the way. And so, this isn't to condone the horribleness. Of course, it has to be unequivocally condemned, what happened on October 7th, but there is a context. And I think, unfortunately, what is unfolding now, and the story is very quickly changing from Israel as the very unprepared victim and catastrophic failure. And that will be studied, I think, for many, many months, if not years. And the trauma that Israelis are facing. Now, a lot of attention is turning to the trauma in Gaza. And whatever side, there's various claims on this hospital attack. The bottom line is many people are dying. And the longer this goes on, and the more horrific the images that come out, and if there is this ground invasion and it is very long and brutal, which most people are predicting, and the U.S. has quite a lot of experience in this, given our own invasions and interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is only likely to increase the I think emotion and tension in this region and the possibility this could escalate. I'm on David's side, and I think that there's many rational reasons to believe that this will not escalate, that Hezbollah is not interested in jeopardizing its increasing capabilities. It has a lot of domestic pressures in Lebanon. David would know much more about that than me, but my understanding is that many reasons not to escalate. Iran has many reasons not to escalate. It's not looking for a direct war with Washington. The U.S. put 2 aircraft carriers in the region to make it very clear to the Iranians not to test the limits here. All of that said, and I have a long list of rational reasons why nobody should want to escalate this. When you are in such an unpredictable and unprecedented conflict, and emotions and tensions are so high, and as the atrocities kind of unfold day by day, I think we have to challenge our previous assumptions about what caution may continue. and what kind of restraint we'll see moving forward. And I do worry not just about miscalculation, which is always a concern on the northern Israeli border and southern Lebanon and other arenas, but I do worry that if it gets to the point where, let's say, Iran is feeling an existential threat, or the Israelis are feeling increasingly existential threat, or if they feel that we no longer can just let Iran sit where Iran is sitting with these proxies all over the region, and we need to hit so-called the head of the octopus. This is kind of an Israeli strategy. There could be intentional reasons to want to escalate if either side believes that actually not escalating is more dangerous than escalating. We're not there yet, but I just say these things to be as bad as Gaza is right now, and it's horrific. This could get a lot worse. And if we get into an escalation, and the Iranians would most likely rely on, they do not themselves want to be in a direct war. We'll see how it unfolds, but most likely they would use Hezbollah carefully, most likely, but also Shia militias who could attack U.S. forces. That's a big worry in Iraq and Syria. If Hezbollah, though, does get into the game, their capabilities are far surpass what Hamas has. They have a missile arsenal with extremely precise and lethal capabilities that could reach all of Israel. And so I think we really need, and this just finally gets to the question of Biden's trip today to Israel. This has to be the highest priority, is to contain the escalation. But also, I have to say here, I think there's a lot of concern in the region that it's understandable he has to show this solidarity with Israel. It is an unprecedented moment. But when you go to the region, the President of the United States, and one of your closest regional partners, the Jordanians, quite dependent on American assistance and support, and usually a quite reliable ally in this region. When even King Abdullah views a presidential visit as a liability and potentially too dangerous to withstand, I think there needs to be some rethinking of what U.S. policy is doing right now. And so it'd be good to see a little bit of President Biden's very impressive empathy that he has displayed, in which I think, Guy, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is very much welcomed in Israel, his approach. But I think on the Arab side, certainly the Palestinian, but now we're seeing in the broader Arab world, a lot of concern about where U.S. policy is headed. So I think moving forward, there's going to be, I think, a lot of rethinking about what the U.S. is doing in this region, how it's doing it, and where we go moving forward. And those debates are only likely to get more tense if this Gaza incursion, if it happens, does not go well.
Thank you, Dalia. And of course, when Secretary Blinken traveled to 6 countries in the region, he definitely heard concerns and worries about escalation, and calls for de-escalation were almost immediate after the October 7th attacks on Israel. Guy, I want to go back to you because you talked about 2 scenarios. And of course, this may also go in other directions. But, we've talked about escalation beyond Gaza with, Hezbollah being pulled in if a grand invasion happens. But you also mentioned the internal political dynamics in Israel, but there's also the West Bank, and tensions are rising also in the West Bank. I think as of this morning, more than 60 Palestinians have been killed. And CNN was reporting that some of these attacks were by Israeli settlers. And so this is also something that is not in anybody's interest to see unfold. But of course, there are worries about that. How do you see the Israeli government and Bibi in particular responding and addressing the West, the West Bank and tensions in the West Bank, but also what is happening internally with Arab Israelis?
Famously, Henry Kissinger once said that Israel has no foreign policy, it only has a domestic policy, which has implications to what it does outside its borders. yeah, as I said, I think every decision that Bibi would take would be influenced by the question of his own political survival. He's a political Houdini. Got out of a severe crisis like that in the past, but nothing on the order of magnitude of what happened a few days ago. I think what went through what David said and what Dahlia said is whether or not Israel would enter Gaza is a crucial question. That would decide the fate of the region, and that would decide whether or not it would escalate, whether Hezbollah intentionally or unintentionally would open a second front. There are a few forces, mine included, that are asking whether it makes any sense for Israel to get into Gaza. Because when you're waging a fight, when you're waging a war, the last thing you want to do is fight on the battlefield in which your foe, your enemy, prefers to fight. Okay, the Hamas has been preparing for this exact scenario for over a decade. All the billion of dollars that came from Qatar, much of it was invested in this underground city of tunnels beneath Gaza City, known in Israel as the Metro. And that could become, very lethal, both for Israelis and Palestinians, if fighting would take place there. The other question is, okay, you eradicate Hamas. What's your next move? You want to get the Palestinian Authority in? Currently it's too weak, corrupt, and unpopular for that to happen. So what are we gaining by getting into Gaza? So, as long as the hesitation continues, as long as the operation doesn't start, there'll be more and more voices that advise caution and pre-planning before doing anything. That said, I think there's still an overwhelming support to do that. Nonetheless, there's in terms of playing to the domestic audience, it makes sense. Revenge. Okay, a lot of people would understand it on that level. And in terms of Bibi's political survival, it makes more sense to enter into Gaza than not. If he doesn't go into Gaza, again, the blame game would escalate inside Israel, and the stability of his coalition and of his government is in jeopardy.
Thank you, Guy. And then I want to turn to you, Ambassador Hale, precisely to also comment on one of the scenarios that Guy mentioned, which is, perhaps what Guy called the optimistic scenario, where the Palestinian Authority is handed Gaza once again, and we all know what state it is in. How do you see also the role of the Arab states in the region, U.S. allies, particularly Jordan, in navigating through this very difficult and very delicate terrain in order to A, de-escalate, and also B, try to look ahead and empower the Palestinian Authority?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I don't see any scenario in which the Palestinian Authority, which can barely function in Ramallah, could somehow be propped up and given enough, adrenaline to do anything in Gaza. It folded 15 years ago, and it just can't. And Hamas, will fight every inch. Hamas wants things the way they are. Hamas is not a partner for two states. Hamas is not a partner for good governance. I haven't seen opinion polling in a little while, but I saw for years Hamas was extremely popular in the West Bank, where it hardly existed, and extremely unpopular in Gaza, where it ruled. And the flip is true of Fatah. So the Palestinian people are just being really punished by everybody. And Hamas is to blame in many ways, as are others, of course, but Hamas is there, and they're not going to turn things over to the PA. They want continual war. So I just don't see that as a possibility, and I don't see how foreign money can make a difference. And as for this summit in Amman, I mean, it would have been wonderful if it had happened, but I don't blame the King of Jordan. I blame President Abbas, who faced a difficult political situation and had to pull out, and he did. I also blame President Sisi and the Egyptians. I mean, what was happening in Sinai? How did all of these weapons get in? Okay, so maybe he wasn't so keen to answer those questions. Why aren't they turning on humanitarian assistance in Gaza? Why aren't they allowing foreigners with dual passports to leave Gaza? Why is it so difficult? Why does the Secretary of State have to spend a week negotiating with the Egyptians over some deal in Sinai? People are just not serious. They don't really want to change. And frankly, the Biden administration before October 7 also wanted status quo. Everything was designed to keep the Middle East as quiet as possible while we turned our attention to China and while we approached an election in 2024, November 2024. Well, that isn't going to work anymore. The Iranians announced, and of course there is a Palestinian issue, I don't deny that, but the Iranians are exploiting it to the hilt, that they weren't going to accept this, that they were going to continue to push. And so the only course right now, the highest priority is not, with all due respect, de-escalation or avoiding an escalation. The highest priority is to restore deterrence. It is strength that restores peace. It is weakness that brings violence. So if you believe in avoiding escalation, you have to, in my opinion, believe in restoring strength in order to prevent this to continue to happen ad infinitum. And then after we've restored together Israel and those Arab partners prepared to join us and the United States in restoring our deterrence and strength, then we can talk about political solutions that are somewhere within the realm of the possible, which frankly cannot, in my view, include any of the current people we know as so-called leaders of the Palestinians. What about normal people? What about the people in Gaza, in the hospitals and in the schools and in the NGOs and in the business community, who actually are the ones suffering the most? Shouldn't we be talking to them about the future of Gaza? Shouldn't we be talking to them about solutions and building from there, the future? Thank you, Marissa.
Thank you, David. This has been a question that was asked many, many times with regards to the future of leadership in the Palestinian Authority, because no one knows who the youth of the Palestinian youth are. And as you mentioned, there are many working in various sectors and passionate about being involved, but there was no space for them to be involved. Dalia, we've talked about, of course, the role of Iran. You've laid out how this the various objectives of Iran versus the United States and Israel in the region. The foreign minister of Iran is in Saudi Arabia today because there is a meeting that brings together all the members of the Organization of the Islamic States, and looking at some of the initial sort of opinion and analysis, or opinion editorials and analysis in the Arab media this morning, many have pointed to things shifting in the region. Ambassador Hale just mentioned that the Biden administration prior to October 7th just wanted to maintain the status quo. So is this signaling sort of a weakening of U.S. position in the region, or the ability to move things as we see, Iran and Saudi Arabia basically talking?
Yeah, good question. I think it's important to note that this just didn't happen this week. The Saudis and the Iranians have been repairing relations for a number of months. They've restored embassies. The foreign ministers have visited each other's countries. But it did take this crisis to get Mohammed bin Salman and the Iranian president on the telephone. So that is concerning. This issue of diminishing U.S. power is always ever present. I think there's a lot of times this is based more on perception than realities. I think, it is no, secret that not just President Biden, but President Trump before him and President Obama before that, were getting tired of the Middle East, right? There was Middle East fatigue. We had 2 decades of interventions that didn't seem to show a lot of payoff. Now the Taliban are back in Afghanistan. A lot of people are asking, what was that for? This is a lot of the warnings that I think some American commentators and military analysts are sharing with the Israelis. Listen to us. We've been there. We know the dangers that can lay ahead. So I think, there was a really across a bipartisan, not putting blame on, I don't know if that's particularly useful at this point to be blaming one side or the other or a particular president for everything that's unfolded in this region. It's long in coming. The United States had other priorities, focusing on China being priority number one. Of course, with Ukraine, we're fighting a major international war, frankly. And so there's a lot of questions about the way in which this could distract attention from that effort. But in reality, the United States was really never out of the region. We still had tens of thousands of troops. I recall when the Trump administration launched the attack to kill General Soleimani, everyone said, well, that just restored deterrence now. So this notion of restoring deterrence is a very murky concept. So I think, yes, we have been there, but there is this perception that the region feels the U.S. was not the only game in town anymore. And I think in many ways that really is true. It's not just a perception. China is, and it's mostly economically, but it's the largest trading partner for countries like Saudi Arabia. 50% of its oil is imported from this region. India is a rising global power that has very strong relationships in the region. So most of these countries, and I think this was faulty U.S. thinking across administrations, frankly, that we were going to get the region on our side to fight Iran, to fight China, push them away, get them back. This whole normalization deal with Saudi Arabia, I think, was based on a lot of faulty assumptions, and I think that's been borne out with events. So that's why I think there's going to be a lot of rethinking about what the U.S. is doing. It's not kind of an either or. Either we're in fully and we're intervening militarily and we're back in the game. And some people might be thinking about that with 2 aircraft carriers moving to this region and Biden, President Biden suggesting to Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu, we'll do whatever it takes. And there will be a push to this restoring deterrence. Certainly the Israelis it's really critical for the Israelis, and because that there was the vulnerability there. But I think, once hopefully we get through this crisis, there will be a sense of, can we handle all these things, or do we need to have also some other new ways of thinking about how to maintain our interest in this region, not just focused on this military deterrence posture, which is also often leading to kind of backfiring. Right now, it's leading to a lot of antagonism, frankly, with our regional partners. This notion that we could just subcontract everything to the region and they'll figure it out themselves isn't working so well. So I don't have answers, but I think it raises a lot of questions about what is the role of the U.S. in the region. Certainly, I think the U.S. has taken a hit, but that's nothing particularly new. I think that's been long in the works. And the United States still has a lot of comparative advantages. We just have to play to them better. And so more smartly. I hope this presidential visit or subsequent diplomacy can get something, both in terms of from the Israelis, in terms of being smart about how they go about this response, but also dealing with this dire humanitarian situation, which was initially the goal of the Jordan summit. My understanding was supposed to be to get those border crossings open. Blinken supposedly had an arrangement, and that doesn't seem to be playing out. So that's all extremely worrying.
And in terms of rethinking, I mean, I know that you've written about the importance of talking to the people, which also Ambassador Hale just emphasized, and this is at the heart of a lot of the work that we have done on Lebanon. It's ensuring that all the voices are heard, but also are addressed. So I have one last question to all of you, and then we're going to turn to the questions that we're getting from our virtual audience. The Abraham Accords, of course, this is the 3rd year of the Abraham Accords, normalization agreements that were signed between Israel, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. And, pre-October 7th, there were multiple commemorations, trade agreements have been signed, free trade agreements have been signed, multiple initiatives on the scientific, education, tech, security fronts. So there was a lot of momentum. How do you think the Abraham Accords will be impacted? Of course, there are tensions, But how do you think this will play out? Guy, starting with you.
Yeah. So answering your question, and also because what Dalia said prepared the ground for that, there was one word that, surprisingly, we haven't mentioned yet, and that is oil and energy. Now, you have to realize that if somehow Iran gets pulled into the current crisis, if instability is projected from the Arab-Israeli region into the Persian Gulf, that would be a disaster for Europe. Europe supporting Ukraine, a Europe which largely cut its energy ties with Russia, a Europe that is more dependent than ever in supply of gas and oil, also from the Persian Gulf. So anything that would happen right now in the Persian Gulf would have huge implications for the cohesion of NATO support to Ukraine. So I think that's why the US has an interest that this crisis will not escalate. And deterrence is very important. But as an Israeli, I'm of the opinion that Israel can enhance its deterrence towards Hamas better if it would not invade Gaza. Actually, in terms of the battlefield, when Israel is outside of Gaza, it controls the sea, it controls the air, it has a lot of capabilities of hurting Hamas without entering Gaza. So I think it's important to understand the energy and oil dimension. I'm sure Biden and the people around him, surely Jake Sullivan, his national security advisor, very well aware of that dimension. And for that reason, the U.S. has a big interest that this crisis would not escalate, but rather would be localized to a conflict between Hamas and Israel.
Thank you, Guy. And this is a very important dimension, just how interconnected all of these issues are. Ambassador Hale?
Yeah, well, I understand what Guy said, but a couple of things, and I'll come back to the Abraham Accords. But one is, if we want to localize the conflicts in the interest of de-escalation, that plays exactly into the hands of Iran. Iran's strategy is to pretend that it is not directly culpable for what's happening, despite the financing and so forth. And it's these proxies, it's hard to control them. And gosh, look what they're doing. Yes, well, there we are. Well, no, you're not going to succeed. We're going to continue to live this until the end of time, unless we actually address the problem of Iran. Now, I'm not advocating for an escalation of military activity against Iran, but I'm saying we have to have a new strategy that recognizes a reality and puts a pressure on Iran in all of its dimensions in order to bring this to an end and restore our deterrence. I would also, I defer, as others I'm sure do, but to the IDF and the Israeli leadership. They know what to do or not do. They're going to bear the consequences for any military activity that they take. And my experience of working for 6 presidents is that they also defer to the Israelis. They don't want to bear the responsibility of a yes/no on military operations. The discussion is going to be what happens after. And the what happens after includes preservation of the Abraham Accords, which, by the way, it was a strategic decision by the Emirates, nothing to do, by the way, with the United States. We learned about it later, to approach the Israelis. And so I think that strategic imperative, it includes challenging Iran and dealing with Iran, will continue. The Saudi deal was more about, frankly, from what I read anyway, what the United States could deliver to the Saudis than what was going on between the Israelis and the Saudis. And so I suspect that will be on the back burner for the next year. It'll come back. We will see. But to me, what we have to really focus on is how are we going to deal with Iran? How are we as the United States going to deal with Iran in a comprehensive way that includes the proxies and includes the regional conflicts that are exploited by Iran and its proxies, including the unresolved issues of the Palestinian people.
Thank you, David. Dalia?
Yeah, well, I think how that was just ended, the Palestinian people, I think that was that was the Achilles heel of the Abraham Accords and the normalization, that there was a lot of rhetoric and talk about how it would help them, but ultimately the perception, if not the reality, was that that issue was marginalized. And it was marginalized because, frankly, it had been holding the region hostage for a long time. Nobody had any good solutions to it. And there were a lot of incentives on the Arab state side, particularly the Emiratis who led it. And I actually think less about a front against Iran. In fact, my understanding over time, they were not so comfortable about the Americans constantly playing up the Iran angle. They actually saw other benefits bilaterally with the Israelis economically, on the technology side, that far more attractive to them than the notion of putting up a front against Iran. And that was particularly the case when they started to get hit by the Iranians after the exit of the Trump administration from the nuclear deal, when Iran started hitting oil tankers and oil facilities in their countries that were very threatening in about 2000, about a year after in 2019. Most of these countries started to repair ties with Iran because they didn't want to be the targets of Iranian retaliation. So that kind of that was the other normalization process going on at the same time. So I think the Iran part is a little bit too inflated in terms of the motivations behind these accords. So in that sense, I think there will be an interest in continuing it in the future, but it's going to be a chill for a while. Publics in the Arab world, people on the ground, Marissa, as you were talking about, it matters. These countries are failing in governance, in many parts of the region. There is rampant corruption. Talk of a new Arab Spring is always in the midst. So, I think this makes these countries quite vulnerable, these leaders quite vulnerable, which is why you're seeing a lot of distancing right now. But some of those trend lines are still there. And on the Saudi, in terms of the ones who had already gone forward with it, on this, I think this conflict makes it clear, though, that you can't just do I think what did Netanyahu say, checking the box on the Palestinian issue, and that's going to be enough. That's over. Nobody wants to return to that status quo. This is clear. You cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. So I think in terms of getting a Saudi deal in the future, that's going to be much more significant than the supposed significant Palestinian component was in those talks to date. So I think that's going to be the main factor moving forward.
Thank you, Dalia. So we have, Guy, I very quickly, because I need to turn to questions.
Yeah. The Likud and Netanyahu have, for the last decade, a long-term vision of linking Israel with the Persian Gulf, specifically with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, that Israel would serve as a transit territory for Emirati and Saudi oil to reach Europe. Israel is already a transit country for Azerbaijani oil to get into Asia through the famous pipeline linking the Mediterranean to the Red Sea that goes through Israeli territory. So that has, a value for the Saudis as well. They want it, besides technology and other stuff, that they would have another avenue to bypass the Suez Canal. It's good for them. So as David said, because of that, we might see the normalization process resurface again after this crisis, washes over.
Thank you. So we have too many questions to address, so I'm just going to choose sort of a few of them. One question to you, Guy. Assuming the hostages are exchanged at some point, can you see Israel strategically releasing Marwan Barghouti in any exchange, since he is more palatable to Israel and can possibly unify the Palestinians?
Anything is possible. We haven't heard Hamas demanding that. It seems right now that we will get to that stage of releasing the hostages only after the question of the ground operation would be decided. I don't decide on that. The Israeli government does. And it seems to prefer to focus on the military dimension right now, rather than on the hostage crisis.
Thank you. And I guess a question that Ambassador Hale or Dalia can address, what is the likelihood that the Hamas-Israel war would spill over into the rest of the world through terrorist attacks and retaliation, as this has happened in the past? David, would you like to address that?
Yes, I think anything can happen. And this is an extremely dangerous time. We're in a transition phase. The rules of the road in South Lebanon, North Israel, had been more or less understood by both sides since 2006, and I don't think that necessarily we can count on them obeying those rules of the road or understanding fully how the other side in such an emotional and fraught environment will behave. I also think if Israel stumbles, if whatever the goals are that Israel sets for itself, if it's unable to achieve them, then the Iranian-backed proxies will, including Hamas and Hezbollah, will seek opportunities to further exploit that so-called weakness. So it's essential that Israel do something that is attainable as its goals, enunciate them clearly to the world so we all understand what it is, by the way, and haven't yet heard from Washington what we want, and then see that we together succeed in them, or else it will expand as you've described.
Thank you. Dalia, would you like to address that as well?
Sorry about that. I think some of it will depend on how it unfolds, but I think things are already out in the open in a way, in terms of the catastrophic events that already happened, that I think have already probably started to get to the emotional level where it could trigger more violence globally. So I think, I'm here in Europe, and certainly that is a major concern. You already have lots of tension because of the war in Ukraine, because of oil prices, because of different kinds of governments in power, tightening migration, Quran burnings. You already have a very volatile global environment. You have a fracturing of the world system. You have very difficult to get anything through the UN Security Council, with Russia and the United States essentially fighting a war against each other. So this is not an easy time globally. So the potential for extremism is very high anyway. And then you put this match onto that already kind of fuel, fire that's fueling. This is bad. We're seeing protest already, very large protests. There's been some shooting incidents. It could expand. So hopefully not. And that is why I strongly do believe, maybe de-escalation is a bad word to some, but I think containing this is really important from a strategic perspective, for the US interest and for global stability. I would say nothing short of that. It really touches every part of this globe.
Thank you, Dalia. And one question from Yanan Wong of the Voice of America. How do panelists think China will leverage this conflict and its broader geopolitical competition with the US? I know, Dalia, you mentioned the role of China and how it is more economically involved in the region. So I'll turn to you, but I know that, Guy, you've also done a lot of work on great power competition. Dalia?
So,
Go ahead, Guy.
Okay, thanks. China has been a free rider in the Middle East, taking advantage of the fact that the United States secured freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf. It would exploit opportunities to invest wherever it can, but I don't think it can replace the United States as the hegemon in the Persian Gulf. And I think that's the key thing. And I think also countries in the Persian Gulf understand that very well.
Dalia?
Yeah, I would agree, although I think we probably should stop getting out of the framework of deciding any power is going to be the hegemon. It's not that game anymore. It is a multipolar Middle East and global global powers working in this region. And so they have different roles. I don't think China is interested. Like you said, Guy, it's had very good run, free riding off of our security guarantees and profiting off of that. I'm not sure. Yes, it's increasing its drone exports and missile technology cooperation and technology issues that they are worrying from a security perspective, but largely is playing this economic role. But one thing that I think in this case, really the U.S. and China would be aligned on is that China is not interested in instability globally in this region, because that will raise oil prices. And that is something the United States most definitely does not want in the context of Ukraine. That's already been very, very difficult for the United States and for Europe, for the Western Alliance, for NATO fighting this war in Ukraine. So US and China have common interest here in calming the region. Russia does not. Russia gains from instability. So I think this is kind of the geopolitical dynamic that we're working with right now.
Thank you. Ambassador Hale, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think China's in the last year been basically opportunistic in taking advantage of the perception of the United States pivot out of the Middle East, but no one's paying the slightest bit of attention to China right now. Nor is China going to take any risks to be a peacemaker or do the difficult trade-offs that the United States is expected to do to help ameliorate the situation. I would differ respectfully that China and the United States may seem to have congruent interest in stability in the Middle East, but our sense of stability, in the Middle East, but our sense of stability may be very different than their sense of stability. They want not just stability, they want control at the end of the day of their energy supplies. And I think that will be the direction of their future policy. And that is not, in the long run, a stable situation for the rest of us. Over.
Thank you. Well, we have run out of time. We hope to address many more questions from our audience in future panels. We will definitely be hosting more discussions in the next few weeks. But I think I would end this with just a breaking news alert that I received with President Biden announcing a deal with Israel to allow humanitarian assistance from Egypt into Gaza and 100 million in US aid to the Palestinians. And that I think is an important step in the right direction, particularly to address the humanitarian situation in Gaza. Guy Larone, Ambassador David Hale, and Dalia Dasake, thank you very much for weighing in and for taking time to discuss the developments in the region. Thank you.